But anywho, happy to open the medical track today. Thank you for having me. I'm today here with two hats. One is from the Open Source Imaging Initiative, and the other was from the Just Transition Center that allows me to focus on this infrastructure question that we need for open source, specifically hardware. So the leading question of the talk is going to be who should own healthcare from a perspective of intellectual property. And once we find an answer to that, how far can we take that claim, actually? So a good example to elaborate on the question are MRI scanners, these room-filling multi-million-euro machines that Sydney Hospital can scan soft tissue. They are the most powerful imaging devices that we have in healthcare, but they're also incredibly unequally distributed. So if you live in Europe, Central Europe, or North America, you're mostly fine, but if you go in any other direction, it gets scarce very quickly. So if you look at the numbers, you can have a discussion how we need to have a better distribution within Europe, but as soon as you go to the global south, the numbers very quickly drop to close to zero. And one of the main reasons, one of the reasons for that is the MRI oligopoly, because it's mainly controlled by three big companies, Siemens, GE, and Philips. And that has been even cemented by a 45-year-old patent pool keeping other innovation and competitors out. And so, since we see that, a little side blow to #BuyEuropean or the Eurostack debate, if you rely on European vendors or on a little oligopoly, you get a domestic vendor lock-in. And I was talking to a couple of developers in our community saying they've been developing PCBs that were producible at €5 costs, but sold for 400 because they have a medical device stamp on them and because there's only 3 main suppliers. So if you want to make healthcare truly resilient, accessible, and democratic, you have to make it open source. And that is precisely how we were founded. And here it is. That is the first open source MRI scanner fit for medical imaging. This doesn't really look like a medical device yet, that's the very first prototype, but it works, and you see it's on reels. And that's also one of the main assets. So the main field strength that we have is a lot lower than with the large scanners. So while the large scanners are something between 1 and 3 Tesla, we work with 50 millitesla, so that's a lot lower, but still enough for imaging. That also means that our bore, what you can scan, is a lot smaller, so we can scan head and extremities or anything that's smaller than 30 centimeters. And it's a mobile system. That is new, so you can have it even in the ambulance itself, because it could be, in theory, battery powered. The entire system runs on 12 volts at the moment. And the material costs are obscenely low. So when you talk a couple of millions, now we're talking 20 to 30,000 euros material costs. So for instance, in Uganda, the rebuild had cost us 24,000, mainly because of customs and these things. And it's entirely open source. So if you want to build your own MRI scanner, here's the technical documentation, all the software as well for image reconstruction and so on. So the applications we see with that are yet to be evaluated, because with that we push MRI into a region where it wasn't imaginable before. Of course, the big goal is to have in vivo clinical imaging scanning, especially like in rural areas and remote diagnosis. But there's also lower hanging fruits, such as veterinary medicine. They're happy if they get any picture at all. Or industrial applications, you can scan avocados or eggs and see if they're fertilized. There's so many things that haven't been even considered yet. Or also just what we do at the moment, research and education, since you can do MRI scans in the seminar room with an MRI scanner that has been built by the students. And that is also just very new. In that regard, there's also a little prototyping platform that is a lot easier to replicate, but has the features of the big system. The same field strength, you can use the same electronics, you can play around with different gradient designs without running into the issues you would have at scale with a large system. So that sounds great, but let's take a closer look into the technology. Let's get some pictures. So can we see anything yet? We're talking low field, right? So Here you can see the, I don't know if it's visible from the back, but on the right side you see a top-notch clinical system with 3 Tesla, and on the left you see 55 millitesla, which is about what we have. And on the right you can see a lot more details to the brain that is imaged here, but if you're looking for the tumor, it's quite visible on the left as well. So it comes down to how much resolution do you actually need in order to do your diagnosis. This is a knee that has been scanned with our first prototype, so that's already pretty possible. And that is a dead dog that was surprisingly easy to get, actually. Or a brain of a developer that was published last year. That is even without any enhancement like AI-based calibration of the images or any of that. That's just raw imaging, what we get from the system as it is now of the first version. We're already working on the second big iteration. So, great, but how does it work? And most importantly, why is it so cheap? I will start with the magnet, or focus on the magnet, because that is the most expensive module of the entire machine. Usually magnets of MRI scanners use superconductors, and they require liquid helium for cooling, and a sophisticated infrastructure around that. So the power supply and the room itself and so things. And that is, of course, very expensive, makes it immobile and very hard to replicate, especially if you're living in a low and middle income setting. So what we did instead was using permanent magnets in a special array that reinforces the field in the center, where we get the 55 millitesla, and cancels out on the outside. So this is one of the rings. It's essentially a cylinder of rings, and you stack the magnets in each of these pockets. That isn't exactly easy to do, and it's also quite hard because the magnets are very, very strong. But it's more or less the limit of what we could do still by hand in these settings. Yeah, as said, you stack the rings together, and that creates the field. And ultimately, you can do a measurement of the field in the middle and apply, based on a Python script, some outer magnets in these trays to balance out imperfections that we have from manufacturing, but also just from the magnets themselves. So it's a quite complicated piece of technology that is also amounts to half of the entire material costs of the system. But some folks in Graz managed to 3D print the rings. So we didn't manage to do that because we experienced issues with warping and so on, but they did that on a DIY printer that they hacked a bit, and that pushed the price for these rings down to 10% of the original costs. So we now have a couple of these in fluctuation and see how they perform in the long run. And if they do, then we can still push down the price for MRI scanning even further. If you want to know more, there is a 7.5-hour long YouTube talk from different people across all of the modules of the MRI scanner, and I've actually met people that watched the entire session. So if you want to dive into it, here it goes. However, I'm going to go a little bit into the history of the project and how this could happen. At the beginning, there was basically only the idea that was aired at a very large MRI conference in almost like nine years ago. So what if, seeing all these problems that we have on a global scale, what if we would make open source MRI scanners? And the responses from that basically split into two parties. One saying it's impossible to do MRI scanners open source because they're so complex. And the other group said, that's actually a very good idea because precisely because they're so complex, we should do it open source because then we have experts in all of these different fields and can push it forward. And that's what we used for our hardcore, like these first people that saw the vision and didn't be afraid about moving forward. So with these people, we got them together, so we needed a communication platform. We started then with essential but still like controllable projects, smaller ones, so we needed a documentation platform. And we needed to make the ecosystem visible in order to show that it is possible and then further grow that. In regards of the communication platform, we used Slack at first because it was very easy to set up. But as you might know, Slack is very good at shifting the user terms, and it became just unusable for us. So in the meantime, we moved to Matrix, which is just so much better in all regards. But for the projects, one of the first ones was Cozy Measure. That is a 3-axis positioning robot that we need to measure the fields. And it was still controllable size. And we could also experiment with how open source documentation for hardware works, because most of the researchers we were working with weren't really experienced with that, also never used Git before and so. And once that was published, we saw copies all over the world, especially in Leiden, for instance. They were also the ones that were driving the first prototype. And they used it for all kinds of things, because it's in the end just a positioning system. And this is our website that we launched in 2016. It doesn't only look cool, it also gives the impression that this project is going to live longer than just a couple of years. We're going to stick around, so people felt more safe to join us. And on this website, we have a little project section where we could map the ecosystem. If you scroll down here, you can scroll forever. Over the years, there has been an impressive size of ecosystem growing in this field that ultimately assembles the MRI scanner. So that was then also a next step. Once we had that, grow and connect. We needed to drive decentralized development with no funding. So what we had instead were researchers, so they could allocate their research in a field that allows developing these modules, publishing them, and then we can together assemble the MRI scanner. That's what we had. We also contributed to policy briefs that then foster the ground to get more funds in the future maybe, and contributed to standards that we also needed for ourselves. So the contributions here, we had projects that were piloting like the signal chain, for instance, how that could work with very cheap modules and make it accessible with for everyone, but also had compact systems that were then also used in the final system, depending on what resources the people had. This was one of the policy briefs that were very cool, bringing together people from scientists from all over the world for open source hardware and also their contacts. So we've suddenly had contact with ESA, NASA, the UNESCO alphabet, and so on, and could push open source for science, but also healthcare in the debate, in the political debate. And we also, as said, worked in standards. So DIN-SPEC 3105 was a standard setting the requirements for the technical documentation of open source hardware, because that's not trivial. You don't just have code under an open license, you have calculations, 3D models, and so on, and not just PDFs. And so we needed to determine what actually makes open source hardware, what do we expect from others. And by the way, this was also the very first German standard that was published under an open source license. So that was also cool. And it made open source hardware so much more approachable for industry players and also donors. Yeah, and then it finally happened. And we could harvest the first fruits of all of our work and also had the foundation for the next way forward. So we've published the very first open source MRI scanner for clinical imaging in the beginning of 2022. It just took us a year to make the blog post. And it's now standing in a university clinic in Leiden in the Netherlands, benchmarking clinical systems. So it does clinical tests as we're speaking now. And the price for all of that was, of course, more work, because now we needed to improve the documentation and we needed to care about sustainable community building as more people were coming. We needed to figure out quality control in a decentralized way, as well as clinical certification if you want to bring it into circulation as an actual device, and think about how commercialization is supposed to work. When it comes to the documentation, we now had a standard that also allowed us community-based conformity assessment of it. So, as you see, open source imaging heavily relies on a healthy ecosystem. This MRI scanner is not an effort driven by one single entity or a little group of developers. It requires a very large global effort in development. However, sometimes this hardware comes with very mixed documentation quality, so you can't really work with it sometimes, and even unreliable licensing. And so this community-based assessment allowed us to streamline that and develop and promote community-based standard for this documentation, bringing it further together. If you hear that and think that's amazing, I want to join that, please consider joining us as a reviewer, also in software, because we need to cover all kinds of different technology fields to make that happen. And if you have a project that you think is valuable for the ecosystem, submit it on the website, and then it will be pushed to the reviewers. So once we have done that, we saw a lot more replications across the world. And if you consider that it takes about a year to build a system and a significant commitment behind that, I found this pretty impressive. So we have 21 systems, either built or in the making right now, that we personally know of in 14 different countries. And it's rapidly growing. Like, for instance, these South African folks just reached out to me a week ago. Nobody heard of them before. I was just asking in the forum. They happen to be in the Matrix channel. So there might be even more out there. And this also reflects the community that we have. It's everywhere and everything. So nation-wise, we have Dutch, German, Italian, Portuguese, Austrian, Paraguayan, Russian, Turkish, or Indian developers, also from Canada, South Africa, or Japan. So it doesn't really matter. And this also goes into culture and into religion, atheists, Buddhists, whatever. We have them all, but nobody really asks these questions because it doesn't matter. It doesn't make sense to exclude people when you're trying to solve a problem on a global scale. Which brings us to governance. So, because OSI has never been a centralized thing, we never had a central institution. For that, we founded a nonprofit 2 years ago that is based in Germany, but it doesn't have to be there. You can also have several nonprofits that are connected. However, this nonprofit serves, on the one hand side, to own community assets, such as the trademark or IT infrastructure and so on, but most importantly, as a neutral legal body for others. So you can now throw money to the ecosystem directly. We can distribute it. You cannot donate to a public research institution. Now you can, and we can also drive the efforts independently, and can also act as a contractual party, which wasn't able before as a community. So, for profits and non-profits. Our vision is to have a network of organizations that act under a common governance model, because it is a very complex piece of hardware that requires technology parks and certification bodies and so on. We can also set common standards with the community. So this, for instance, when you have built the scanner and you think you're good, this is a Hello World phantom that you can put in there and see how good you are. And most likely, with the very first scan, you end up on the left scale. And then you do the measurement with the robot you've seen before and iterate more and more until you can see an actual picture. And then you have other phantoms that do more, the fine-grained things. But these are the things that are essential to make it grow. The standards are part of the infrastructure of it. And this is just one piece of it. Another thing that we need to standardize are open regulatory commons. We have a project going on that does that for the medical device regulation in Europe, and we try to open sources as much as possible within the legal constraints that we have. And then you just need, the idea is that you have a template, you just fill out your names, conduct these tests, and staple it to the back, and then you can distribute it as a medical device. There's others that have done that before, mainly for software, mainly in North America, where you can collect these examples and use it for templates. And the vision of that is to get the paperwork done together, because bureaucracy shouldn't be a blocker for this kind of vision. So if you're asking yourself why I haven't heard about it yet, please consider joining our PR team, because our PR is horrible and we need to bring the message out there. We are a group of researchers and developers, and we work and don't talk about it. So I think now it's the time to get it into the broader discussion, especially policy. And that brings us back to our first question: who should own healthcare? And more precisely, is an open source license enough to do that? When I talk about democratic technology, I see that we have a central requirement there, which is the cost of change, and that should, or has to correlate with the representativeness of the network. As an example, if you have a very low cost of change, you might have software that can be forked and maintained by anyone. And that means that even if you have, that the governance model doesn't really matter in that case. So even if you have dictators, they are forced to act in the interest of the community, because otherwise people just fork and maintain it. So you rely on speaking on behalf of your community and act upon that. And the same goes for any for or non-profit that would control the ecosystem. However, so the conflict resolution in this kind of network essentially, as said, works like that. If you don't like it, you fork it. And that ultimately creates something that everybody can use, because the better technology gets through, the technology that goes after the needs of the community. However, if you have a high cost of change, say hardware that for replication needs special equipment and significant investments, then little design decisions that doesn't really make a big deal in Europe, but they can impact the replicability, maintainability, operability for entire regions and exclude them essentially from the downstream use of it. And it also means that if you have unequal resources, for instance, to drive the development, that equals into unequal representation of the technology. If we are developing for the Global South has to have a seat at the table. Otherwise, it's very rapidly excluded because of our blind spots. And for that, to bring it together, we need a dedicated governance model that balances out potential dominant actors. At the moment, it doesn't really matter, because we're all idealists, we're all driven by the mission, but as soon as money gets into that, and Siemens might want to join as well, then we need to have a very stable governance model in place. And here, the conflict resolution would much more look like in de jure standardization, where we have to come to a common agreement in order to move forward. We cannot just fork. So the proposal for that is what I call open source reference technology. You have an open source project that is hosted by a non-profit or anything else with a purpose-bound capital. And this non-profit essentially mimics a standardization platform, a neutral ground where you can take these decisions. And that ensures a representative and due process for everyone. That's the sole purpose of this non-profit. It can also asset own community assets and even spin-offs and technological infrastructure that everybody can use. The distribution of the technology would still work via the private market, private actors, because it doesn't matter. As soon as you have the technology in a way that represents everyone, that's fine. And then you certify these for-profit partners from the non-profit, and then you can make sure if you get a scanner under the trademark of open source imaging, you know that it has been according to all these values. And yeah, it's going to also happen in courts of roading rights and so on. The goal of that is to have commons public partnerships for public infrastructure. And it doesn't end with healthcare. There's so much more public infrastructure that could rely on commons. So the utopia vision is to have a collaborative ecosystem of atomic organizations that do research and development, production of tools, and storage, logistics, marketing, all under this community-based governance. There are examples in the for-profit sector, even like supermarkets that have this model, so why can't we pull that off for the open source community? And it gets more pressing because recently, this model would include disposable for-profit. So recently we've seen in open source 3D printing a push for patents that are patenting already published technology. So the pusher printer, for instance, has this ejector and or the extruder, and they even used the same technical drawing to file the patents in China, then in Germany, and from there on further out. And Pusher doesn't have the means to go on court against all these patents all across the world, and it's only one. There's so many more patents out there as well. But what you could do is have For Pusha, they rely on one single company that sits in the middle, and that is very vulnerable. If instead you have a network and you can dispose the organizations that sit at the interface, that do the distribution of the scanners or the printers and would be sued to begin with, that would make it so much more resilient. Yeah, that was proposal 1. Proposal 2, tell me over beer. I only have one proposal, but if you have a better idea, please get in contact with me. I'm very interested to pull that together. And that said, I think we have a couple of minutes left to do a brief Q&A on that. Thank you very much.
Any question?
Sorry,
yes.
I forgot, if you want to get in touch with OpenSys Imaging, here's a QR code to join the Matrix space and contact details. And otherwise, if you want to get into contact with JTC for all these meta questions or legal issues and so on. Here.
The QR code. The QR code. Just 1 minute. Okay.
Thank you. So great presentation, great work that you are doing together with the team and all the contributors. The first question that I have is regarding the perception from the clinicians. So did you have already exchanges with the clinicians, and what is their perception in comparison to other like proprietary technologies that they can fully trust, let's say it in that way?
Great question. It's actually the first time I'm getting that. So it's a very mixed reply. So in one hospital in Germany, in Hamburg, they weren't really impressed by that because they said we already have the large scanners. Why would patients like to choose the small scanners instead? I don't really get it. It's a cool initiative and it's great for research, but I don't see the application here. Also in Germany, in Berlin, another hospital was guiding us around through the hospital saying we need these kind of scanners here and there for several reasons. One thing is that they're mobile. And so if you have patients from emergency cases that can't be moved, you can move the scanner to the patient and scan them there. Also just to have prior assessments how they're doing and if they need a larger scan. Another thing is that if you have large scanners with large, like very strong fields, they usually distort the image if you have anything metal implant. So it doesn't have to be magnetic, also a Titan already distracts the image. So if you have a brain implant or wherever, and post-operation, the doctor has absolutely no way to see whether it's sitting in the correct way because he can see shit in the picture. And for that, the low field doesn't do that. Small field, and then you can, of course, with a little resolution, but see how it's sitting. So that is just in Germany, where we have the access to these large scanners. But there is, we're also in contact with clinics in Indonesia that said we have all these little islands, and it doesn't make sense. We cannot afford to put these large scanners on all of the islands, and people would need to travel to the main island in order to get a scan. So we need these as well. Other than that, of course, we have clinics in the global south as well that want to use the scanners because they don't have anything. So there's one system running in Bolivia trying to benchmark if they can do stroke imaging with that and so on. Yeah.
So do you see a big difference between Europe and US market and the rest of the world for this product?
I don't know if I understood it correctly. There's a bit of echo here.
If you see the difference between the US market, the European market, and the rest of the world.
Yeah. I mean, at the end, we were all targeting the same market, which is the clinic, but the urgency of need and the exact application is a bit different, yeah.
And do you think that there will be the gap worse and worse, or are you optimistic, or are you...
It's hard to tell. So we might see more urgency in the global south, but we have more production facilities in the global north. And as I said, there's so many more application cases that aren't explored yet. So I don't know where it will scale the most. At the moment, we are in the global north, so we will pilot it here. But there's independent initiatives in the global south that do their thing. Let's see what takes off faster.
Okay. Any other question? Well, 2 questions, and we have 3 minutes. Okay, yeah.
Thank you for the great talk. My question is, so sometimes if you say it works, and it works from a technical perspective or from a perspective of a doctor, it's different. So how would you assess the maturity of this machine? Would you say that you could give it into the hands of, for example, Doctors Without Borders, Ärzte ohne Grenzen, and deploy it with them to some remote areas in Laos, and they can work with it without having a technician like you at hand? What would you say that would work, or is it still in kind of a tech preview phase?
So if you, so at the moment we did the easiest setup that we had, that was in the lab or in the clinic, where we had rooms at the same temperature all the time and where we had radiologists available. And if you want to move it to somewhere else on wheels or in the car where it's hot and changing temperatures, there's a couple of things to consider first. So the scanner, because of the permanent magnets, has a very heavy temperature shift, so it needs to stay on a certain temperature for a while, and then you need to calibrate and so on. This is actually right now still a manual task, so you need test scans and then need a bit of technical knowledge to put it together. And of course, you still need the radiologists to do the actual imaging. If Doctors Without Borders are willing to dip into that at the stage where it is at the moment, would be great. We would love to support that. But at the moment, because we needed to get the system running to begin with, it's a very recent development. Actually, we are focusing more on the clinical setting. And if it runs there, then it runs hopefully anywhere else as well.
I'm coming.
I'll try to condense my tones of questions because I work with MRI, so I'm really fascinated, and thanks for this talk. My question would be about data. I don't know if I'm putting another iron of your already big fire, but I was wondering whether you have your own version of data model or DICOM tags, because for commercial vendors, the juice of the image sometimes is in these hidden tags. So if you want to reproduce what they were doing and the quality of that image, you just cannot. So I was wondering whether you opened also your schema for the DICOM, but this is if you're thinking about an international repository for all the data generated by this scanner, maybe to, for example, do this kind of remote diagnosis and so on. But thanks again.
Yeah, that's also the idea. But since you mentioned the software ecosystem, MRI is one or maybe the only imaging technology where clinicians can actually have the opportunity to get raw data out of the machine other than CT or something. And so many of the software models we use are also used by researchers that act with the big scanners. So, which is how we cross-fertilize these different areas. But ultimately, of course, if we want to set up a telemedicine network and so, we need to rely on open source for that and to make it also GDPR compliant and safe.